move on to technological constraints. Now, this is going to be really similar to almost like, it's going to be a little bit different, but thinking this is like a budget constraint. So technology is going to limit the amount of inputs that we can put in to get a certain amount of outputs. So technology limits the combination and amounts of inputs that can be used to get a certain amount of output. If we're going to list all the different combination of inputs to outputs, that's going to be what we call the production set. So all the combos of inputs to outputs, this would be the production set. Now, if we wanted to summarize this information a different way, we might use what we call a production function. So the production function gives the max output, the maximum of output we can get from different levels of inputs. So let's erase this and draw, what a production function might look like, and that's going to be different depending on assumptions we make, as well as what the production set would be for that production function. All right, so let's say the inputs are going to be on the x-axis and output on the y-axis, or output is y and a level of inputs is x. If you want to draw a production function, again, the shape of it is going to be determined by other assumptions we're going to make. But if we put y, or output, up here, and x, or inputs, down here, we might get, let's say, our production function looks something like this. So it's showing us all the different amounts of inputs we can put in, and it's translating that into an output. And so it's a function. So f of x equals y. This is the output. This is the input. And this f here is the actual production function, in that it's taking some amount of inputs, it's applying some function to it, and getting some amount of outputs. So this is just how one production function might look, one that has a certain properties, which we're going to discuss later in this chapter. Now the production function gives like the maximum you could produce given the level of input, but in reality we could produce kind of anywhere under this production function. We just wouldn't be maximizing our output with the level of inputs, but we don't have to produce the max, we could produce somewhere in there. So this is really similar to like that idea of a budget constraint, right? It's just a little bit different. Now everything kind of below the production function, we could be able to produce. Anything along this production function line is the maximum we could produce for using all of our inputs. And anything kind of outside of it is not feasible. Like we couldn't use this many inputs to produce this much output. So technology is limiting, how much output we get for these different inputs. Is the production function in terms of number of inputs. So for example, with one input, we just saw we might have, y equals f of x. If we had two inputs, maybe we'll have y, so output, is now a function of x1, which is the amount of input 1, and x2, which is the amount of input or factor of production 2. So here are these two inputs. And it's oftentimes going to be kind of convenient to have these two different types of inputs. We could generalize and have more and more and more, but that's just going to kind of complicate the analysis. Or maybe if we kind of concentrate on two different types of inputs, maybe variable and fixed kind of inputs, this will give us an idea of what's going on without having to, have very, multi-dimensional diagrams and things like that, right? Kind of like with the two goods was usually enough to analyze consumer theory. We didn't need to have, k different amounts of goods they're trying to maximize. We can do that. We're just not losing much by kind of concentrating on this a little bit simpler case. So this would be, by this I mean f of x1, x2, the max production possible with x1 units of input 1 and x2 units of input 2. Okay, so we can generalize. In a lot of cases, we are going to have two different types of inputs instead of just having more of them, or instead of having one. Though sometimes we'll collapse it down to one again if we can possibly ignore one of them if we're looking at maybe short run versus long run. But we're going to talk about that in a bit. But now let's kind of link this into something that's going to be quite familiar to us. It's going to be very similar to this idea of indifference curves, but now it's going to be production levels. So let's quickly erase this and discuss this idea of isoquants.